Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a German game by the name of Muss Auch Gönnen Können. Forgive my German pronunciation on that. It's a dice game put out by Schmitzspiel for 1 to 4 players. The box says ages 8 and up, which seems about right. And the game will take about half an hour or so to play. It is a card drafting, tableau building dice game where players are going to be assembling a group of cards in front of themselves in order to create either scoring opportunities or to give themselves powers that will help them to create more cards or to complete more cards. The game is very interactive, and it's well in line in terms of complexity with some other games that they've put out in this line, such as Knock Mall and Ganz Schön Clever. So let me take a few minutes to show you how the game works. It'll give you a better sense of what I'm talking about. Then I'll come back and talk about my thoughts on the game. So Gönnen Können is a dice game where players are going to be trying to complete cards that are placed in front of them. These cards are essentially going to be in two types. There are scoring cards and bonus cards. The bonus cards, once you complete the top requirements, are going to give you the ability to manipulate dice. The scoring cards will all score at the end of the game, and only if you've completed the top parts of them. So you can see the top parts are going to have specific dice requirements that are required to fill them in, and then when you complete it, you'll put a little check here indicating that you've completed the card. And then at the end of the game, it will score points, or during the game, it will give you access to these powers, which you'll have a limited number of uses of. So you can see, for example, this card here wants you to have a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, with the 3 being a green die. This one, for example, wants you to have 2 5s and 3 6s, the yellow being a 6 die. There are some other ones in here. For example, this one, you could put 8 dice on there. They all have to add up to at least 40. There's color specifications for 6 of those 8 dice. Here, for example, you need to have 5 dice, which get increasingly high in value. They could be filled in any order, but the third one does have to be a blue. And just for example here, there are 4 dice required of the same value. 2 of them have to specifically be pink and green. Again, those could be filled in any order. So those are the types of requirements that you're going to be completing to be able to activate the bottom halves of these cards. So over the course of the game, you're going to be building out a tableau of cards which have specific requirements tailored to you and specific rewards for completing them tailored to you. So at the start of the game, you'll start with 2 of the scoring cards and 2 of the bonus cards and put them into what is going to be the start of a 3x3 grid in front of you. And you can arrange those pretty much however you want, although each card that you place would have to be at least diagonally adjacent to the other card. So you couldn't do something like this. But this would be fine because this one's adjacent to this one and diagonally adjacent to this one. Once you have 3 cards in a row or a column, so for example, if you did this, it would define the rest of your 3x3 grid. So you would only put cards here, 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 and that would determine your 3x3 grid. But if you're here, for example, your third column could be over here or over here, and it won't be defined until you bring in another card. In any case, once each player set up their initial 3 cards, returning the card that they then choose to the bottom of the appropriate discard pile, then the game will begin. And the game is going to be played over a number of rounds until a player gets 9 cards in front of them. Once that happens, the game is going to be triggered. You'll finish out the current round and do 1 additional round and then do your final scoring. On a player's turn, they're going to become what's called the active player, and each round will have each player being the active player once. And as the active player, what they're going to be able to do is roll these 5 dice. They're just standard D6s in 5 different colors, and then use them to do one of 3 things. The first thing that they could do is use them to entirely complete one of these cards. So the trick of this game is that if you wanted to, say, complete this card here that required 4 of the same value, you would have to, and you wanted to use these dice, you would have to use that to entirely complete that on one roll, the results of your current dice. So you could not put in, for example, these 2 6s and then use these numbers somewhere else. All of your dice would have to be, or all of the card would have to be completed using these dice. That's the real catch. The second thing that you could do is that you could buy a new card. So you could see here that there's a market display, and using 3 or 4 dice of the same value, you could buy a new card add that to your display. Again, you're going to need to do that over the course of the game to get more scoring opportunities and more potential powers. The third thing that you could do is that you could choose to re-roll. So let's say this player wanted to work on this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 situation here. The green one has to be 3. So here they have a 1 and a 5, but they don't have a green 3, so maybe they would choose to re-roll. So what they would do is they would set these two dice aside, and the game actually comes with a construction area that you could do that on. For example, right here, you could set those on there. Whoops. I believe that was a 1 and a 5. And then you would get to re-roll the other dice. These dice that you re-roll, now other players immediately could fill in one spot on any one of their cards that are in front of them, or they could potentially even use it to buy a dice here by using special powers. But essentially they have access to either this blue 2, orange 6, or green 4. Each player could choose one of them to use. Again, multiple players could use the same die or whatever, but once all players have chosen to do that, or I guess pass if they don't have any use for any of those, then this player could evaluate whether they want to use these dice or roll again. Maybe they're still holding out for that green 3, so they would roll again. And again, every player would have the option to do something with this orange 3 or this green 4. Once they've done that, then this player could choose to, buy a card from up here, or use those dice to complete a card down here. Now in this case, they have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they couldn't do they don't have a green 3, so they wouldn't be able to complete that card. They don't have 4 of a kind, and they don't have this situation here where these dice are getting higher to lower with those specific colors. So it would seem like they're in a bind, especially because they can't buy a card from up here because they don't have 3 dice of the same type. So in that case, the active player has the option to do what's called a chance, and they could do one of 2 things with that. The first is that they could simply take 2 of these dice and use them to fill in spots on their board, so individual spots. So for example, they could say, I'm going to use this 5 to cross out this 5 down here, and maybe, for example, they would choose to put this green 4 up here. They would just write a 4 in right up like that there. That will make these 2 cards potentially easier for them to finish in the future. So since you do have to complete a card as the active player all at one time. So that would be one thing that they could do. The second thing that they could do for the chance is that they could simply draw one of the cards off of the top of either of these piles and immediately add it to their display or discard it. If that's the case, they don't fill in anything on their turn. So, like I said, that's pretty much what a round is going to be. You get up to 3 rolls as the active player. You could use the results of the roll at any time to fill in all of a card, or multiple cards if you had several that were just one away from being completed, for example, or buy cards. And you could do those 2 actions any number of times using the dice that you have. Or once you've done your 3 rolls, you could do a chance, which is basically fill in any 2 numbers using the dice that you have. They don't need to be on the same card. Or just draw a top card and add it to your display. The catch is every time that you re-roll, and you can re-roll up to twice, the dice that you re-roll, other players will get to use those to fill in spaces on their cards. So once this player's done all of that, they'll pass the dice to the next player. They'll get to be the active player, roll dice, and re-roll, and so on. So that is basically the structure of the game. And over the course of the game, you're going to be activating powers on your cards or setting up scoring conditions once you complete the tops of these cards. So for example, once you've gotten all 5 of these crossed out, you would put a little check here to indicate that you could use this power here up to 3 times. This power here lets you discount the cost to buy a new card by 1 die for every check mark you put here. And again, you could do that up to 3 times. So that's a way to get extra cards. This one would let you manipulate your dice numbers by up or down by 1 for each check mark that you put here. So again, you could do that up to 3 times. Some of the cards are going to be scoring cards. They're going to give you conditions at the end of the game based on how well that they're scored, as long as the top is completed. So if you completed the top of this, every orange card in your display, whether or not it's completed, would be worth 5 points. Whereas this one gives you 8 points per orange card that's directly adjacent to this card if this card's completed. So you can see the harder they are to do, the more points they might be worth. Some other examples, for example, this one here will give you 5 points for every row or column of entirely completed cards. This one here, every different bonus card that you have is worth 5 points. So, for example, if these two were completed on this player's tableau at the end, there you have 5 for this one, 5 for this one. Here, for example, if you have all 5 different colors of cards present in your tableau, this one's worth 25 points. There is a card here, for example, that this one, at the end of the game, you could determine which single color you want this card to be as long as it's completed, which could help you score some of the other cards. So like I said, the game's going to go until a single player gets their 9th card in front of them in their tableau. At that point, you'll finish out the current round until every player's been active player and play one more round. And then you'll go into final scoring. And then each player is simply going to look at all their scoring cards, add up their totals, and it gives you this card to do that on with your dry erase marker. Whoever has the most points then is going to win. The tiebreaker would be whoever has the fewest empty spaces on their completed cards or on their cards in their display. And that is pretty much how you're going to play Gönnen Können. Alright, so that is Gönnen Können. And this is, as you can see, a pretty straightforward game in terms of what it's asking you to do. You're simply going to be rolling dice and trying to use those to complete the cards that are in front of you. The real twist of the game, which I think I emphasized while I was explaining how the game works, is that as the active player, you have to basically complete an entire card if you're going to progress toward it at all. So that really makes the tactical decision making that you're doing as an inactive player a lot stronger than it is in a lot of these dice games that have come out over recent years, where there are turns where you're the active player and turns where you're the inactive player. Trying to create situations so many of your cards could be relatively easy completed on a given turn is where a lot of the strategy lies in this game. So you're able to maximize those active player turns. And that, I think, is an interesting press your luck element to this game that makes it feel pretty distinct versus other games. I will say, though, even with that component of the game does seem to have a higher luck factor than some other dice games of its sort. There's only so much that you could do to mitigate your dice results in this game, and those things are pretty hard won. At the start of the game, there's not that much that you could do if you have just a terrible bad roll where you're not able to complete a card, which you probably won't be able to do at the start of the game. You'll often be forced to either buy a card or just use a chance and just fill in 1 or 2 things because you've rolled poorly. And the players who are able to roll very well at the start of the game will get a pretty distinct advantage, I've found in my game so far. So it does feel like, even though there are ways to mitigate the luck in this game, you really have to complete an entire card and give up a lot of scoring opportunities in order to even get those things. So the game does feel like, to a certain degree, you're going to be really managing that luck, maybe more than in a lot of other dice games of this length. So because of that, I'm not sure that I'm head over heels in love with this game. I think that it's an interesting game, and I like the opportunity to build out your own scoring opportunities or to mitigate luck by building out cards that will let you do that. But I almost feel like, to a certain extent, that those opportunities to mitigate the luck of the rolls, since you're only getting at most 2 rerolls, and often you really need, like, for example, a green 3 to complete your card, it does feel a little bit restrictive, and I wish that that the game gave you another opportunity to do that. Of course, all players are playing with those same constraints, so that bad luck is generally going to be evenly distributed around the table. But to a certain degree, it does feel like there's a lot of turns where you have no option, and those tend to be the turns early on. So digging out of that hole does make the start of the game somewhat feel more luck dependent than I would generally prefer in a game like this. Again, this is something that, as you get better at strategizing and creating opportunities over the course of the game, so that you only need maybe 1 or 2 dice once you're the active player to complete a given card. That's going to shift over the course of the game. But early on, you might feel a little frustrated when you're playing this, especially maybe your first play or two. I will say that the game has had as I've played it, it's been pretty swingy in terms of, winner versus non-winner, and that's really intensified the feeling that maybe more than something like Gone Strong Clever, this is a pretty luck-dependent game where, if you roll well, it'll make the game for you, because you're only trying to complete 9 cards, and among those 9 cards, most of them, or half of them, may not even be scoring cards. So trying to, the difference between scoring a card and not could be huge. It sounds like I'm being very negative, I think, towards this game, but I think that's because I want people to know going into it that it is going, because it's in the same line as Gone Strong Clever and Knock Mall, which are, I think, both really strong games, that this is maybe more of a luck-dependent game. Even though it seems like that strategy of building out your display is important, ultimately, there's only so much that you could do in managing the ultimate dice luck of the game. So this is very much a dice game. It's not necessarily a game that doesn't feel like a dice game, even though it has dice in it or anything like that. And a lot of the times, the opportunities that you're going to get as an inactive player will benefit other players more than some other players. So that element of luck is present as well. So like if you need a blue 3 and somebody happens to offhandedly reroll a blue die and it comes up as a 3, that might really set you up in a way that doesn't set up other players. And that's, in no way am I saying that this is necessarily a problem with the game. It's just trying to describe what type of game this is. Overall, I do think that the game is interesting and it holds my attention, even though it does last about 30 minutes or so. It's just that ultimately I'm not sure how much longevity this has in it, because you're only going to be building a display of 9 cards over the course of the game, but there's only, maybe a half dozen different types of cards in each deck, so there's not that much variety that's going to be present from game to game. So I've played, for example, to go back to Gone Strong Clever in the same line, I've played that game, dozens of times, whereas I don't think that this one's going to keep bringing me back, even though I've enjoyed my plays of it so far. It just doesn't have the same appeal, I think, that does long term. So it's a decent game. I think that the hook of forcing you to consider your rerolls carefully, because that's going to give other players extra dice, is somewhat limited, because often you're forced to reroll because you don't have a good action off of your first 2 rolls. So you have to reroll twice to be able to even do that chance action, where you could just fill in a few things on your boards, which essentially gives every other player 2 dice as well. So you're getting 2 dice and they're also getting 2 dice. So I something about that just feels a little bit off to me. But ultimately, this is a game that I think is worth trying. It may not rise to the height of other dice games that are out on the market, and there are a lot of them right now, but it's not necessarily a stinker either. It's a nice, decent dice game that is, I think, well within the trend of recent dice games. Clever in its own way, but not necessarily a game changer. So those are my thoughts on Muss Auch Gönnen Können. Thanks for watching.